He was 5 feet tall, walked with a limp, and had barely finished primary school. He had spent his 20s as a tailor's assistant and a factory worker. And for 26 months between 1936 and 1938, he ran the most lethal state security apparatus in history, overseeing the arrest of 1.5 million people and the execution of 681,692 of them. His name became a word. In Russian, Yezhovshchina means the time of Yezhov. It means the era of mass death. And when it was over, Stalin had him dragged screaming down the corridor of a building that Yezhov himself had designed, into an execution chamber with a sloping floor built specifically for hosing away blood. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The nobody who became everything. Nikolai Ivanovich Yezhov was born on May 1st, 1895. For most of his life, he claimed to have been born in St. Petersburg, a story he later admitted was fabricated to make himself appear to have working-class urban roots. During interrogation in 1939, he confessed that he had actually been born in the Suwalki Governorate in what is now Lithuania, the son of a man who worked as a tailor, a forest warden, and eventually the operator of a tea house that functioned as a front for a brothel. He lied about his origins the same way he would later lie about everything else, methodically, without guilt, and only because it was useful. He completed a few years of primary school and left. From 1909 to 1915, he worked as a tailor's apprentice and then as a factory laborer at the Putilov Works in St. Petersburg, one of the empire's major industrial plants. He was 5 feet tall, walked with a limp, and had what contemporaries described as an almost skeletal thinness. In 1915, he was conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army and sent to the Eastern Front. He was wounded, returned to Vitebsk to work in a gun repair shop, and when the February Revolution came in 1917, he joined the Bolsheviks. He was 22 years old and had never finished school. He had no political theory, no intellectual reputation, no distinguished military record. What he had was the capacity to work without rest, to follow instructions without hesitation, and to feel nothing that interfered with his usefulness. He fought in the Red Army during the Civil War, then moved through a series of provincial party secretary positions in Mari Province, in Kazakhstan, in Semipalatinsk, demonstrating the kind of gray administrative competence that the Soviet bureaucracy rewarded not with fame, but with promotion. In 1927, Stalin encountered him during a trip to Siberia to oversee grain deliveries and brought him into the apparatus of the Central Committee. By 1930, Yezhov was running the Central Committee's Personnel Department, the office that controlled who got which positions throughout the entire party structure. By 1934, he was a full member of the Central Committee. By 1935, he was its secretary, with responsibility for supervising the NKVD. Boris Nikolaevsky, a Bolshevik who had managed to escape the Soviet Union, gave one of the most memorable descriptions of Yezhov in this period. He said that in his entire long life, he had never encountered a more repellent personality. He was reminded of the cruel boys from the workshops of Rasteryaeva Street, whose favorite entertainment was to tie a piece of paper soaked in kerosene to a cat's tail, set it on fire, and watch the animal run screaming down the street, unable to escape the flames getting closer and closer. He had no doubt, he said, that Yezhov had amused himself this way in childhood and was now doing the same thing on a different scale. A different observer from the same period, the writer Nadezhda Mandelstam, described him entirely differently. She had met him in the early 1930s and found him a modest and rather agreeable person. There was nothing ominous about him. He was pleasant, he was polite, he was unremarkable. Both descriptions are accurate. Yezhov was, depending on the context in which you encountered him, either a perfectly ordinary Soviet functionary or something that cannot be fully described in ordinary language. The difference was whether he had been given permission. The promotion. December 1st, 1934. Sergei Kirov, the head of the Leningrad Communist Party and one of the most popular figures in the Soviet leadership, is shot in a corridor of the Smolny Institute by a former party member named Leonid Nikolayev. Stalin arrives in Leningrad the following morning, personally interrogates Nikolayev, and signs a new decree the same day allowing suspects in cases involving political violence to be tried and executed within 24 hours with no right of appeal. Within hours of Kirov's death, Yezhov is supervising the NKVD's arrest of lists of suspects that Stalin has personally drawn up. Kirov's murder was the opening Yezhov needed. Stalin chose him to oversee the falsified investigations connecting the killing to opposition leaders Zinoviev and Kamenev. Yezhov worked through those interrogations with the same qualities he had brought to every job he had ever held. Tireless, detailed, entirely without sentiment. When Zinoviev and Kamenev refused to confess, Yezhov applied pressure that escalated until they did. When they were tried in August 1936 and executed, Yezhov's reward was the position of People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, head of the NKVD. He was appointed on September 26, 1936. The man he replaced, Genrikh Yagoda, had been judged by Stalin as too slow, too cautious, too unwilling to destroy the party's old guard with sufficient enthusiasm. Within weeks of taking the position, Yezhov began the systematic elimination of Yagoda himself, along with most of his staff. He brought in approximately 300 of his own men from the Central Committee apparatus and placed them throughout the NKVD hierarchy, replacing every layer of institutional knowledge with personal loyalty. Then he turned the machine on the Soviet Union, the Yezhovshchina. What Yezhov administered between September 1936 and November 1938 is documented with extraordinary precision in the declassified Soviet archives. The numbers are not approximations. They are the records of an industrial process. On July 30th, 1937, Yezhov signed NKVD Order 00447, entitled Concerning the Operation Aimed at the Subjecting to Repression of Former Kulaks, Criminals, and Other Anti-Soviet Elements. One historian described this document as the most brutal state decree of the 20th century. Notable because it spelled out the logic and procedures of mass killing with no attempt at euphemism. The order divided targets into two categories. Category 1 meant execution. Category 2 meant 8 to 10 years in a labor camp. Quotas were assigned to every region, every republic, every province in the Soviet Union. Moscow and its region, 35,000 arrests, of whom 5,000 were to be shot. Western Siberia, 17,000 arrests, 5,000 to be shot. Ukraine, 28,800 arrests, 8,000 to be shot. The total initial quota was 269,000 arrests and 76,000 executions. These numbers were starting points. Regional NKVD chiefs and party secretaries immediately began requesting increases. More executions, higher quotas, broader categories of targets. Moscow encouraged them. The quotas multiplied. By August 15, 1937, 2 weeks after the order was signed, 101,000 people had been arrested and 14,000 convicted. By the time Operation 00447 was formally halted in November 1938, approximately 767,000 people had been condemned under it, of whom 387,000 were shot. The order was just one of Yezhov's operational instruments. Parallel to it ran a series of national operations targeting specific ethnic groups deemed collectively suspect. The Polish operation was the largest. Between August 1937 and November 1938, the NKVD arrested 143,810 Soviet citizens of Polish origin and executed 111,091 of them. Poles were 0.4% of the Soviet population. They were 12.5% of the Great Purge's victims. The German operation arrested 56,747 people of German origin and executed 41,898. The Finnish operation, the Greek operation, the Latvian operation, the Romanian operation, each followed the same structure: quotas, troikas, execution by shooting, burial in mass graves. In total, the NKVD under Yezhov arrested 1,575,000 people between 1936 and 1938. Of these, 681,692 were executed by documented official record. The actual number of deaths, including those who died under torture, during transport, or in the initial months of camp imprisonment, was substantially higher. When the KGB was asked in 1956 to provide figures for the entire period from 1935 to 1940, it produced an estimate of approximately 19 million total arrests and at least 7 million deaths. Those numbers do not fully capture what they mean at the human level. When families of the arrested came to NKVD offices to ask about their relatives, they were told that the missing person had been sentenced to 10 years without right of correspondence, a standard phrase that meant the person had been shot. When those 10 years elapsed in 1947 and 1948, and the relatives came back asking why their fathers and husbands had not returned, they were told the person had died in prison. Most families never found out the truth until the Soviet archives were opened. The Red Army. The military dimension of the Yezhovshchina is almost impossible to comprehend from a strategic standpoint. In 1937 and 1938, Yezhov, on Stalin's orders, systematically destroyed the professional leadership of the Red Army at the precise moment Germany was rearming and preparing for war. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the most innovative military theorist in the Soviet system, the architect of the Red Army's operational doctrine, was arrested in May 1937, tortured until he signed a confession with what his captors described as blood-stained pages, and shot on June 12, 1937. He was 43 years old. 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals were executed. 13 of 15 Army commanders were executed. 50 of 57 Corps commanders were executed. 154 of 186 division commanders were executed. Of the 80 members of the Supreme Military Council, 75 were shot. More than 35,000 Red Army officers were executed or imprisoned. The institutional knowledge, operational experience, and professional competence of the Soviet military was destroyed in 18 months. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The catastrophic collapse of Soviet defenses in the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the encirclements, the mass surrenders, the inability to mount coherent responses at the command level was, in significant part, a direct consequence of what Yezhov had done to the officer corps 4 years earlier. The men who should have been commanding Soviet armies in 1941 were dead. Their replacements were younger, less experienced, and had learned to prioritize political reliability over military judgment. The private crimes. The official record of what Yezhov did runs to millions of names and hundreds of thousands of execution orders. The private record is more specific and in some ways more revealing. He signed personally the execution orders for those closest to him, his own NKVD subordinates, colleagues who might be able to testify against him, people who knew too much about the internal workings of the terror apparatus. Later, when he was himself under investigation, he admitted in interrogation that he had purged 14,000 Chekists, members of the secret police, during his tenure. Then he added, apparently without irony, "But my guilt lies in the fact that I did not purge enough of them." He arrested the writers and lovers who moved through his wife Yevgenia's social circle. She was the editor of USSR in Construction magazine, a literary publication, and knew many artists and intellectuals. When Yezhov instructed her in September 1938 that he wanted a divorce, knowing that his position was collapsing and that her Jewish origins made her an additional liability, she understood what was happening. She began writing desperate letters to Stalin, none of which received a reply. The people closest to her were arrested one by one. On November 19, 1938, she took an overdose of sleeping pills and died. Yezhov did not attend her funeral. The great short story writer Isaac Babel, who had been a close friend of the household, was arrested in May 1939 after Yezhov, under torture, named him as a spy. Within a week of the confession, Babel was seized. He was interrogated for 9 months and shot in January 1940. Yezhov's adopted daughter, Natalia, who had come from a children's home as an orphan, was sent back to the orphanage after his arrest. Her surname was changed from Yezhova to Kayutina to sever any visible connection to her father. She survived. It was later established with considerable irony that her biological parents, the people from whom she had been taken and placed in the orphanage in the first place, had themselves been victims of the Yezhovshchina, the fall. By the spring of 1938, the signs were already visible to almost anyone paying attention inside the Kremlin. In April, Yezhov was given an additional appointment as People's Commissar for Water, Transportation, the same kind of secondary posting that had been given to Yagoda before his own arrest. In August, Lavrenti Beria was appointed Yezhov's deputy with Stalin's explicit backing. Beria immediately began taking operational control of the NKVD from below. Yezhov, sensing what was happening, began frantically executing any prisoner who might be able to testify against him. He drank heavily. He fantasized, according to accounts from this period, about killing his enemies, including Stalin. Stalin's calculation was straightforward. The terror had served its purpose. The party's old guard was destroyed. The military had been broken to submission. The population was paralyzed by fear. Continuing the mass operations was now damaging the Soviet state's functioning. Too many engineers, administrators, and officers had been killed or imprisoned. Yezhov, as the public face of the terror, was the logical instrument for ending it. By attributing the excesses to Yezhov's personal fanaticism rather than to Stalin's instructions, the terror could be wound down while Stalin remained its innocent superior, betrayed by an overzealous subordinate. A letter from Beria, Andreev, and Malenkov to Stalin, dated January 29, 1939, accused the NKVD under Yezhov of allowing massive, unfounded arrests of completely innocent persons, and stated that Yezhov's leadership had not put a stop to this kind of arbitrariness, but sometimes itself abetted it. This was, in the most precise sense, a fabrication. Every operation Yezhov had conducted had been initiated, approved, and directed from above. But it was a fabrication that served Stalin perfectly, and it became the official account. On November 25, 1938, Yezhov was formally relieved of his position as People's Commissar for Internal Affairs. He attended his last Politburo meeting on January 29, 1939. After that, Stalin stopped receiving him. On April 10, 1939, he was arrested. The execution. The prison that held Yezhov was Sukhanovka, the NKVD's most severe facility located outside Moscow. Under torture, he confessed to everything the interrogators required: espionage for Germany, sabotage, conspiracy, terrorism. He also confessed to homosexuality, which under Soviet law was a criminal offense. He claimed afterward that all confessions had been extracted by force. His trial was held behind closed doors on February 2, 1940, before the military collegium of the Supreme Court, chaired by the notorious Soviet judge Vasily Ulrich, the same judge who had presided over the show trials of Zinoviev, Kamenev, Tukhachevsky, and dozens of others whose confessions Yezhov had personally helped extract. At his trial, Yezhov declared that he would die with Stalin's name on his lips. After the verdict was delivered, Yezhov was allowed to return to his cell. Half an hour later, guards returned and told him he had been condemned to death. On hearing the sentence, he fainted and had to be caught by the guards. He was brought back into the room. The prosecutor Afanasyev informed him that he had the right to appeal to the Supreme Soviet for clemency. Yezhov asked, bewildered, Yes, Comrade Procurator. I want to appeal for pardon. Maybe Comrade Stalin will do that." The appeal was read to the Kremlin by telephone. It was declined immediately. When Yezhov was informed, he became hysterical. He wept. He had to be dragged from the room, struggling with the guards and screaming. On the night of February 4th, 1940, Yezhov was taken to an execution chamber on Varsanofevsky Lane in Moscow. The chamber had a sloping cement floor designed for hosing away blood after executions. It had been built to Yezhov's own specifications. He was shot there by NKVD executioner Vasily Blokhin, the same man who had spent 28 consecutive nights in 1940 executing Polish officers at Katyn. Yezhov was 44 years old. His body was cremated, and his ashes were deposited in a common grave at the Donskoy Monastery Cemetery in Moscow. Beria gave Stalin a list of 346 of Yezhov's associates to be shot in the aftermath. 60 were NKVD officers. Another 50 were relatives and sexual partners. The question that Yezhov's story forces is one that the Soviet archives, now partially open, still cannot fully resolve. How much of what happened was Yezhov and how much was Stalin? The documents are clear that Stalin initiated every major operation, approved every significant quota, signed execution lists containing thousands of names, and personally directed the interrogations of the most important defendants. The documents are equally clear that Yezhov administered the machinery with enthusiasm that sometimes exceeded what Stalin had requested. Regional NKVD chiefs were encouraged to ask for higher quotas, and Yezhov encouraged them. He was not a reluctant instrument. He was a willing one. When Stalin decided in late 1938 that the terror had gone far enough, Yezhov's first instinct was to accelerate it, not stop it. The Soviet Union after 1938 used him as a scapegoat. The official narrative became that Yezhov had acted autonomously, that Stalin had been deceived, that the terror was the product of one man's pathology rather than the deliberate policy of the state. Soviet citizens who had spent the Yezhov China terrified in their apartments, who had heard the knock at the door in the night, who had stood for hours outside NKVD offices asking about relatives who were already dead. They were supposed to believe, when it was over, that Stalin had known nothing about it. One writer described what it felt like from the inside. During 17 months queuing outside a Leningrad prison, a woman standing behind her in the crowd recognized her and whispered, "Can you describe this?" And she said, "I can." Something like a smile passed over what had once been the woman's face. Nikolai Yezhov could have described it too. He built the machine, he ran it, he fed it everything it needed. And then, in a basement with a sloping floor that he himself had designed, the machine ate him. The name of the era of mass death in Russian is Yezhovchina. It means, literally, the time of Yezhov. In Russia today, the word is still understood by everyone who hears it. It requires no explanation. It is its own definition.